Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Authors Amplified series. I'm Trevor Williams with Global Atlanta. We're so grateful to have you today. We've got your microphones muted and your cameras turned off for a reason. It's not because we don't want you to participate. We actually do, very much so, but we are going to reserve our bandwidth here for our featured speaker, Dr. Jagdish Sheth. And in just a moment, I'll give a broader introduction to Dr. Sheth, but before we start, I want to just tell you a little bit more about the series you find yourself in today. We are Global Atlanta, again, is an international business news website. If you haven't heard of us, check us out on globalatlanta.com. We have a variety of newsletters, but our main purpose is to showcase how Atlanta is connected to the world in business, education, culture, and other aspects. We so far believe that we're unique in the world of international business reporting and looking at the local aspects of these things exclusively, and hope to stay that way. And actually, I may ask Dr. Sheth throughout this interview for some strategy pointers on how we do that. But we started this series about 4 or 5 months ago, Authors Amplified. The goal is to focus on Georgia-based voices in international business and international affairs. We find that often international affairs related organizations will import expertise into Atlanta and share that expertise with a local audience. We find that there are a lot of people hidden away at universities and elsewhere in our community that have a lot to say that don't often get the megaphone. So hence the amplified phrasing. So this series is sponsored by the Atlanta Global Studies Center, which is a collaborative center between Georgia Tech and Georgia State University, but also includes their consortium partners, including Emory, where Dr. Sheth is based. And Dr. Sheth, I really feel like, is a tireless advocate of international education in Georgia and has endowed many awards at various institutions. So he's definitely generous with his support and makes it very ecumenical around the city. And I feel like that was sort of, in a way, a precursor to the Atlanta Global Studies Center. I don't know if they would have gotten that had you not helped to knit everybody together. The universities are becoming very collaborative. We can talk about that some as we go. But first, I wanted to introduce you, Dr. Sheth, and you've got a long bio, but mainly your day job is Charles H. Kelstadt Professor of Business at the Goizueta Business School at Emory University, globally renowned marketing scholar with 50 plus years of experience teaching. You've been at USC, University of Illinois, at Urbana-Champaign, Columbia, MIT, and Emory. You're a recipient of the 2020 Padma Bhushan Award for Literature and Education. And a lot of people don't know about this here in the US especially, but this is one of the highest civilian awards given by the government of India. And when I tell people from India that I know you, a Padma Bhushan Award winner, people's eyes just bug out. So it's obviously very prestigious. I won't go through all your publications and everything. But particularly relevant to the discussion today, you're the founder of the India-China-America Institute, which you and I have talked about quite a bit. And we're going to get into a little bit about that, what you call the new global triad here pretty soon. But today's book we're going to be talking about is, and I've got it here, The Global Rule of Three, Competing with Conscious Strategy. So Dr. Sheth, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Trevor, for inviting me.
Great. Well, I'm going to jump into it. We've got a good number of folks on the call. We're still waiting on some to come in, but the bio is now, I think your bio and the book summary and everything is now in the chat. So we will just jump into the conversation and go from there. Well, tell us about the rule of three. I mean, this is a concept that's been, that you didn't, I don't think you created per se, but have elaborated upon and researched quite extensively. But can you articulate this rule and what it means in general, and then we'll get into the global aspect.
Sure, and I will also tell you how it came about. I was doing a major consulting job for AT&T when it was a whole system together.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the initiatives AT&T was asked to do is to sell phones rather than rent them. And AT&T created AT&T phone centers in shopping malls, 1,800 of them, 1,800.
Wow.
And they were losing money. So the question was, what is retail competition in shopping centers, especially. So we looked at that, and suddenly that's where I discovered the rule of three in a very different way. All competition is two kinds, not one kind. You either have a volume-driven players who believe in turnover, rapid turnover,
Mm-hmm.
and there'll be usually big box kind of companies like a Walmart, for example, Target to some extent. Groceries would be Kroger, for example. In a shopping mall, in department stores would be the ideal one, like Sears in the one time, Montgomery Ward, you might remember the name J.C.
Mm-hmm.
Penney, and of course, more recently would be other names, that are coming about in the shopping centers. But in between those anchor stores, a typical shopping mall will have three full line generalists, which are department stores. Any product line you want, they have it. And any customer who wants to buy it, they say welcome. In between are specialty retailers. They don't behave the same way. They are driven by margin, not by volume. They're very selective in the merchandise they offer, which is why they're called specialty retailers, or
Mm-hmm.
in the customer base that they serve. So there are two kinds of specialists. A product specialist, like a Foot Locker, sells only
Mm-hmm.
athletic shoes. And a market specialist would be like the Limited, Benetton, and there are many more brands, brands for everything today. Expectant mothers and their clothing, for
Right.
example, to teeny boppers and their clothing, just goes on. Usually in styles like garments and shoes, etc., would be more likely the specialist, pretty much. Now they make money, as I mentioned, by margin. So you have to have some sort of an exclusivity advantage, something that differentiates you. And usually they do differentiation on the merchandise by great salespeople on the floor and providing a lot of service.
And
Service
selection, right? Yeah.
is interesting.
Yeah.
But what about if you neither have the volume advantage nor the differentiation advantage? Well, then what happens? Actually, you don't survive. You go in what we call the ditch.
Right. So I want to ask you about that. Okay. So the three in the rule of three is the three full line generalists who are the market leaders by
Yes,
market share, right? And
correct.
then you also have so tell us how that breaks down market share wise in your research and where were the deficiencies in the original models of competition in markets that you saw?
Yeah. If you go back to the economics literature, they always talked about concentration of market share as it is debated in the current government, for example, especially technology companies. And the question is, what is the concentration level? And ultimately, it turns out that 3 to 5 players will control most of the market. But in the analysis, they never figured out these niche players who are
Mm,
specialist differential advantages. There was another theory for them in economics called monopolistic competition. How do you command monopoly rents, as the word was given? So
mm,
there are two different competitive models. This says no, every market is a combination of the both.
yeah.
And long there's an evolution. Industry begins with a lot of specialties. There's a shakeout merger. Ultimately, you have three generalists and a few number of specialists. And after a while, the generalists begin to give up certain product categories, creating another market altogether.
Mm.
Cycle repeats between a specialist and the generalist. That's the main concept. Now,
So
the rule, yeah,
why is
go ahead.
this a rule and not a theory or a suggestion?
Right, because it is so obvious and so much validated by so many product categories. So our first research was 150 different product categories,
Mm,
and it works like a clockwork.
mm,
So the research is not at the company level. Sometimes company and the product are synonymous, but if you're a conglomerate, then you have to think about competition by each product category. So let's say you're a Procter and Gamble competing with Unilever, for example, in America, which is very common, but they don't really compete across the board.
hmm.
Unilever is in ice cream business. Procter and Gamble has no ice cream business. Procter and Gamble has obviously coffee business, so they compete with Maxwell House, which is General Foods. So by
Hmm.
product category, when you analyze, you begin to really get a sense of rule of three. That's key. That's one factor we found. The second is that we found that rule of three seems to be prevailing all throughout every walk of life. So it seems like there's something Trinity principle
Mm,
that is in religion, people talk about it. Trinity principle comes across everything. In physics at one time, it was a three-dimensional thinking primarily. So we have been very intrigued, and we don't know why rule of three prevails worldwide. Ours was mostly applying into the marketing or into the business strategy. Yeah, but rule of three prevails. So we have studies done, by the way, following first book. There's a very academic article. One of my colleagues did that thing, where we were able to show that the optimal profitability for the industry is only when there are three big volume-driven, market share-driven players, not fourth, not two, not one. Monopoly does not give you as much. And at the same time, enough choices made for the consumers, which goes back to my earlier research on consumer psychology, which is how I grew up. And we found that usually people do not make choices from hundreds of choices. They narrow down to a consideration set, a small number, then they compare them, and that number turns out to be three also.
Yeah, and isn't there a pricing strategy that hinges on three as well, right? Like you have the premium option, the the lower tier option, and then you have the middle option that you kind of really want people to go for. I don't know what that's called in the literature or whatever, but
now I'll tell you, ultimately the objective of this session and a webinar is that you will think about rule of three everywhere in your life.
we'll just be seeing threes everywhere as we walk through the shopping mall.
So right, the markets are segmented by three segments. You have a premium market, then you have a value market, and you have a price market. The premium market usually is about 15 to 20%. The volume market is about 50 to 65%. And the price market, surprisingly, is only 10 to 15%.
Yeah. Well, tell us about how this breaks down from a market share perspective. It seems that, you have these specialists who I think, it's sort of counterintuitive in some cases. You don't want to grow beyond 5% because when you get to the 5 to 10% market share category, you are now in what you call the ditch. And then your optimal percentage is somewhere between 10 and 40, and then the return starts to decline after that. Talk about those numbers and why those are the benchmarks, I guess.
That's very true. So generally, a super niche company, let's say Tesla as an example. I'm just dreaming up an example right now. Tesla began as a super niche company, high priced, low volume. Now it is trying to gun for volume. As you grow from 1% market share, which is even less than that, to more and more market share, the chances are you may end up in the ditch. You may not be able to cope with the growth cycle because you have an operational difficulty, supply chain problems, for example, going into countries and markets where not everybody may be friendly to you, like China market right now for Tesla, for example, just goes on. I can give you the examples. So the odds are against you to make it, although many companies do it at the same time. The worst failures I find are usually in pizza industry, where a good starting like Godfather's Pizza, for example, great company, good formula, very differentiated themselves on some ingredient or the way they make pizza. If they go to stock market and raise money through IPO, now there's a pressure to grow.
Right.
And in fact, there are so many franchisors who have gone in the ditch in the pizza industry alone, or the same thing would be true in the Dunkin' Donut type, for example. So franchise business usually is very susceptible to this problem.
Yeah, because you tend to think, I have this formula that works, why not replicate? But so if you are a market specialist or a super niche player like Tesla, how do you then cross that chasm, to use the marketing speak, to get to that to part of the big three without kind of undercutting yourself in the process or getting stuck?
So there are two ways. One would be that you are a serial entrepreneur. You grow the business all the way to 5%. Either you do IPO or pre-IPO, sell to one of the big boys who is looking for you and the merger acquisition wise, and actually command a premium. And you go on to start another company, another industry in the same category or a different category, depends upon your flavor. Or the other option, which is more common when it's a family-owned niche business. And there are certain family-owned businesses 500 years old.
Right.
Generation after generation. In the wine industry, you can see that thing Pretty much it's a tradition that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Many European companies are in that category. They want to remain niche, which is a great strategy. I don't want to grow.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be exclusive. I want to be something that people rave about, etc. Reputation. Or what you can do is that you grow the core business, first brand, first product up to a point, and then you begin to go super niche,
Mm-hmm.
opposite. Don't go for volume. So actually, Porsche did that, surprisingly. Porsche 911 platform is where they grew up to a point. Then they tried to go into a lower end and almost died. Then they said, why not go for a super niche? So we come out with a Porsche with $500,000 or $1 million nowadays. It's not uncommon to buy a Porsche, for example. Hitting into those performance cars, which are Italian made generally, kind of stuff, which is
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
Yeah.
Now, on the volume side, Trevor, it's very interesting. It's very predictable. Usually, an industry starts with many, many players. If you go back to the history of the auto industry at the turn of the last century, when auto industry
Yeah.
began, we probably had 200 car makers.
Mm-hmm.
Each one made one car at a time in their garage, handmade mostly. Model T came, Henry Ford invented, mass market assembly line, got a huge cost advantage, basically wiped out everybody, and only niche players are surviving now.
Mm-hmm.
And then it begins to grow. So three players that survived were General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. They
Mm-hmm.
became volume-driven players.
Yeah.
Now, predictably, share for the top one is always around 40%. Uncanny, above 40%, getting market share actually is non-profitable to the company.
Mm-hmm.
40% is the optimal level of market share you should have. Second company usually ends up about 20%, and a third company about 10%. Below 10%, you cannot be a viable volume-driven player.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
in fact,
how do you know if you are stuck in the ditch?
yeah,
I mean, is it just
exactly.
market research to know what your percentage is, or it seems like in a lot of cases or a lot of markets that actually the majority of companies are there, right? So how do you know, and is it a death sentence? I mean, are there ways to claw your way out?
There are ways to crawl your way out. First of all, let's figure out how you go in the ditch. So on the volume side, there are three players. If there are 4 and 5 players, and if there's a competition between number one and number two in a non-growing market, as it is happening in PC business, for
Hmm.
example, or it happened in beer industry at one time in the 80s. Soft drinks happen when Pepsi and Coke compete on price or distribution, when Budweiser and Miller compete on beer business. Number three, number four, number five have a chance to go in the ditch.
Mm,
As I mean, their share is less than that, pretty much.
right.
So once you are in the ditch from the volume side, or you are in the ditch by growing too fast as a niche player, there are two curves that you can see in the map
Right.
primarily. So
Yeah.
now you're a driller, so what do? So you have three options. If you come from the volume side, you become more and more like a niche player by abandoning most markets where you are
Hmm.
not profitable. So in retailing, like A&P collapsed at one time because they were having their own private labels as opposed to branded grocery products. And what they decided, somebody bought them out, and what they decided was to reduce the number of stores only where they were profitable and there was no competition, essentially. So you become a niche player. That's
Hmm.
clearly an obvious strategy you do. Second strategy is that if you came again from the volume player like number 5, number 6 market share company, you jump to a private equity people buy you out.
Hmm.
Then the private equity people will buy you not just to get you out by cost cutting, etc., but add more and more ditch dwellers and consolidate the industry. And sometimes it's called a roll up by the private equity people. When you do a roll up, surprisingly, they become pretty significant in size.
Yeah.
In hospital groups, that happen all the time.
Right.
Okay, so that's the
Yeah.
other way.
Yeah. Yeah, so one of the things that seems interesting and maybe a bit counterintuitive to me in the book, which of course you people listening to you now can see that there are tons of examples that you cite, even in your speech, but also in the book, it's even more. There's even more detail, and I really appreciated that, and appreciated how easy it really was to read, even though there's a lot of theory baked into it. It's actually a nice, entertaining read as well, partially because you focus on so much on the companies and their experiences, which I
Yeah.
really appreciated. But you talked about a few things that I thought were somewhat counterintuitive to the way that we think about, or a lot of people think about business these days. One is that you said, innovation is not often something that's completely new, but it's the repackaging or the better use or
Yeah.
the scaling up of an existing technology, and that tends to mean that a lot of times the pioneer is the one that falls into the ditch and does not achieve profitability. Can you talk about that a little bit, and
Yes.
how we might, if we fancy ourselves innovators, how might we
Mhm.
avoid facing that fate?
No, it's very true that except for maybe government support through regulation or patents,
Mm-hmm.
or government blessing you as a de facto standard, where government is your biggest customer and they nurture you,
Mm-hmm.
there is always the case that an industry pioneers usually become casualty.
Mm.
It is the second wave of people who come in, rediscover the technology, make it more contemporary, appropriate, etc. They make money.
Mm.
The electric car is nothing new. First of
Right.
all, it was there before, just as an example. It has been very true in electronic games, for example.
Mm.
We had the Atari, Intellivision kinds of names. We invented that. They all died in the first wave, but then Japanese took that technology, perfected even better. So you saw the Sony, Nintendo, and those guys came in. Again, rule of three prevailed, all three Japanese companies. Watch industry, the same thing. I mean, we were dominant through Timex watch. We took the volume market. Swiss watches became more precious even in the process,
Mm-hmm.
like a Rolex and above in many ways. There are many, many good brands, but they remain niche players. So Timex was the big volume player, surprisingly. Pin lever, as we call it, which is a
Mm-hmm.
mechanical approach and automation, and became very large. But the Japanese took over that market in a transition of technology from the mechanical approach to quartz, as they call it.
Mm-hmm.
So three companies, again, all were Japanese at one time.
Mm.
Seiko, Citizen, and Casio.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just goes on and on. I can
Yeah.
give you
Yeah.
an example.
Well,
So
let's talk about, because I think this ties into what you're talking about. You talk about how growth most often occurs, like growth to get, especially to get to the volume, the top tier of market share, the big three or whatever you want to call it, usually happens through combinations or M&A rather than organic growth over time. And then you also talk about the fact that you know, capital capital is the market maker.
yeah,
That so we tend to think of these things as if we just have the best strategy, then we'll prevail. And what it seems like I'm hearing you saying, it's more important if you have a marketing and a brand, and
yeah.
b capital to fuel your growth. Is that Do I read you right there?
No, I think you're absolutely right because brand allows you easy entry. Customers are waiting for you, especially advanced country brands into emerging markets, which is a growth engine.
Mm,
Nobody can make it without the Chinese market today in cell phone industry
mm,
or in consumer electronics, even for that matter. And so is India at the same time. Those are two very big consumer markets. And so those are the brand new markets. There is no local competition. Therefore, you are allowed to come in there either on an export model or you manufacture depending upon economics and rules and regulations. So that's very interesting. So you take your technology and expand into those markets. It's very
mm,
possible.
mm,
In grocery stores, by the way, most diversified manufacturing companies are actually grocery companies,
mm,
Procter and Gamble, because
yeah.
they're conglomerates, but even though the stock market treats them as a single entity. So what you can do is very simple. You say, all right, I want to let go certain product lines. So Unilever will announce we'll let go tea business as they're exiting the tea business right now. They consolidated the tea business by buying Lipton, Brook Bond, and one more brand and became very dominant, for example. But now they're in their strategic plan. Tea business is not reliable business because of the supply chain problems, because tea is
Mm-hmm.
grown in certain parts of the world, whatever the reasons are. And so they're exiting their in their strategic plan. So the tea business now will be bought by a competitor.
Mm,
Coffee business, same way on the other side. Detergents for that matter. So companies usually allow divesting certain things. Give you an example. General Electric was a great example, which was a conglomerate at one time, decided consumer electronics is not their future. They were the largest TV brand. They even bought RCA television to even get a larger size. And everybody believed that now they will dominate the market because they have so large market share. But suddenly Jack Welch announced, I'm exiting the whole television radio business and
Mm.
sold it to, I think, Thomson Electronics in,
Yeah.
in
Right.
France, and in exchange for medical electronics.
Mm.
So
So
all
there are these cycles, right? They're
So they're segmented by the application, not the consumer side. They said we cannot compete in that one, but we are a very good B2B company because we have an energy business, we have the airplane leasing business, etc. We understand corporate markets, more
mhm.
so enterprise markets, more so than consumer markets, even though they began as a consumer company. They did
Yeah.
the same thing more recently by selling the appliance business. They were number
Mhm.
2 next to Whirlpool, and the Whirlpool still is number 1, and they sold it to Haier, a Chinese company. So they are exiting the appliance business, for example.
Mhm.
So mergers, acquisitions is very good platform quite often in a non-growing, stable industry where you want to either expand your market base
Yeah.
or you want to expand your product line in some fashion.
Well, like it sounds like it works and bidirectionally as well. So, you talked about Haier, for instance. That's a Chinese brand who's, huge around the world, not so big in the U.S., acquiring GE's business to enter the U.S. market, right?
Yeah.
In a meaningful way, and in a way that they
And
couldn't do if they did it organically.
by the way, that's true for Lenovo, which is a Chinese
Yes.
brand, by buying out IBM ThinkPad,
Hmm. For
which
sure.
gave them a huge presence in American market. Yes.
Yeah. So, I'm backpedaling a little bit, but I wanted to ask you, I think the concept of the rule of three is that, you said competition is both oligopolistic, if that's a word, like among a few, and it's also monopolistic in the sense of in these niches, you have monopolists, in
Correct.
the 1 to 5% market share range. But as you noted, we don't really think of it that way, right? We think of it as, okay, if one company gets too big, we have to break it up,
Yeah.
that's kind of my understanding of the extent of how we think of competitive markets. So, how do you recommend policymakers change the way they think about regulating big markets, especially new ones like ride hailing, for instance, or
Yeah.
autonomous vehicles coming up? Those kinds of things. Um, should it just be allowed to kind of grow on its own, or does the government have a role to play in fostering the market and standards?
Governments have an enormous role at the early stage of a rise of an industry. I did a lot of work on cellular technology from Bell Labs and commercialization by policy in this country, in America. And while we were allowing the market process to have any standard, TDMA, CDMA, as we call it, AMPS was
Hmm.
a sort of the analog platform. Motorola had its own standards that went on. We believe in America as a capitalism free market. Let it sort out and casualty arises. It's a part of the process.
Right.
Construct destruction kind of a notion, and let the best winner rise.
Hmm.
Europeans decided that's a bad model because this technology needs huge volume, and the volumes can come with a standardization. So they decided all of Europe, before European Union even was created, primarily a GSM standard. So government GSM standard, everybody had to comply with the standard. Market was created by standard, and it became much larger platform. So today, GSM is the dominant platform in wireless technology, not what we invented in America.
Hmm.
It's very common.
Do you
So
think?
governments can play an enormous role, as Chinese government is playing right now in many of its technology companies. As we have played surprisingly in the history of our case, we have supported industries to create standards.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the internet obviously is a good
Yeah.
example of that. But
Yeah.
I'm wondering. You mentioned China. Does this have particular resonance today? Because as you argue, the new front of international competition is in technology, and you look at things like the financial technology sector in the U.S. has lagged in terms of security, has lagged Europe because you didn't have a standardized technology, and you have 13,000 financial institutions here versus a
Right.
much more consolidated industry there. So it was easier to set a broader standard. Whereas now, people are just as of a few years ago getting the chip cards in the mail, a technology that France pioneered and had been in place for 20 years in Europe. So I guess my question is, in this new world where, particularly recently, we're seeing a lot of geopolitical competition being framed in technological terms. Do you think this standardization has a particular resonance?
Oh, I think it'll have even more resonance, whether it's in the space race. We have a separate space force now created to focus on that side, allocate resources as we created with NASA at one time to, as a challenge to Sputnik, for example. And as I have mentioned separately outside of this webinar, I have a paper through my institute. There's a second Cold War that is starting. The first Cold War was with the Soviet Union, mostly on ideology, capitalism versus communism. And two blocks were created. Balance of power was pretty stable competition between the two blocks, skirmishes here and there. But it was primarily with the notion that I'm here to destroy you and you will destroy me. So nuclear sort of a, the balancing the nuclear on both
Mutually
sides.
assured destruction. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for that mutually assured destruction. The new Cold War is going to be not on I destroy you, but I paralyze you.
Mm.
I don't have to destroy you. I can just stop your social activities, your government activities, and the new battle will be fought not on ideology, but on technology.
Mm.
And there are new weapons of technology created which are more software based as opposed to hardware. In the old days, the military was all hardware,
Right.
mechanical, electromechanical. I mean, they were not really smart machines. We have
Hmm.
added embedded smartness now with digital technology now. I mean, F-16 fighter plane did not have an LCD screen, for example, at one time. It came in consumer products like a watches, etc., but upgraded itself all the way, in fact, into the military grade. But today it's the opposite.
Hmm.
The technology will come at the high end, and pretty much that's where the competitive advantage, or at least the Cold War, will be decided pretty much. And it is emerging very clearly between China and the US now.
Yeah, yeah. So, and India seems to be right in the middle of it. So that's why I wanted to talk to you about this new global triad, as you framed it. And I wonder if triad was subconsciously used given the nuclear connotation, but since we're talking about security here. But what was the old global triad for one? And is it still, is the construct of these big three countries being
Yeah.
essential to a global firm's competitive balance. Like, is that still relevant?
The old triad power was primarily 12 Western European countries, not the whole European Union, but they were the Western allies essentially. US, Canada, and later entrant was Japan. They controlled 75% of the world GDP economy, value add you do on raw materials to consumable products. And they control 45% of the world trade among themselves. Why 45% only trade? Because they still relied on their former colonies to
Hmm.
provide raw materials, agricultural or industrial raw materials, sometimes manpower, also, for example, as a resource. So they had to import a little more. Otherwise, they were self-sufficient. They did not need anybody else.
Hmm.
They could go on chugging along pretty much. This has changed over time from Europe, Western Europe, America, North America, and Japan as an old triad power. There was a brilliant management consultant, Kenichi Omai, Harvard, MIT PhD, joined McKinsey, became head of McKinsey in America, still very, very brilliant scholar. He wrote that book called The Triad Power,
Mm.
showing all the data. Of course, Japan was the later entrant into that.
Right.
Now it is shifting over time. The new triad power is America still survives, but the second one is China now, and third one is India, which is a shock to people because here are two emerging economies. 40, 50 years ago, nobody knew anything about China. It was a communist company, but they unlocked their potential. We helped them out quite a lot by shifting our manufacturing there, giving them the technological know-how, plus, of course, the buying
Hmm.
power, essentially, because we made things for our interest. All the garments were made in China at one time. everything, pretty much made in China was dominated,
Right.
and have come out very, very well. India is coming out the same way. And the
Mm.
reason is that if you take the purchasing power parity, which I like as a measure better than the nominal GDP, as we call it, and the purchasing power parity says that given the currency exchange rates fluctuating, you take a market basket of goods and simply say, if it's costing so much in America, how less will it cost in other countries?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in that way, the ratio between China and America used to be 1/3, because China has large population
Right.
and labor is cheap. You can get service at home, maid service, for example. India is the
Mm-hmm.
same way. So
Mm-hmm.
service aside, they're very affordable. Even
Mm-hmm.
middle class can afford maid and servants, whereas here we have a struggle with having anybody to help us, kind of a notion. So given that, the largest economy now in the PPP actually is China, $27 trillion.
Mm.
We are number two, about 20 trillion. In GDP, we are higher still, okay?
Right. Right.
And I like the buying power notion more
Mm-hmm.
so than the production notion, kind of a notion.
Yeah, and I
And
think you've argued that India's lower nominal GDP rating is not indicative of the buying power in the country, particularly when you
exactly.
factor in savings, right?
So for example, on the purchasing power parity, India is about 11 trillion economy, whereas on a nominal GDP, it's about 3 trillion, just
Mm.
about slightly lower than Germany or France, one of the two countries.
Barely above South Korea, right, with 40
Barely
40
above.
million people, right? So there's a lot of room to grow for India for sure. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, so but I'm particularly interested in you got the book behind you, Chindia Rising, right? Like there's this idea that there was an increasing integration between the two, and now that seems to be challenged, right?
Yeah.
So do you look at your book and wonder why you wrote it, or are you still confident that there's enough commonality between these two, particularly given all the bifurcation of the way that they've grown, right? China more manufacturing oriented, India very services oriented, and now this new security and technology angle. I find it interesting that everyone's talking about the Himalayas, right? Like the
Yeah.
skirmish that happened in the Himalayas. But yet, if you look at the business side of it, I mean, Chinese companies still are investing heavily in India, from a capital perspective and also from a manufacturing perspective in smartphones and other sectors, more so than the U.S. is investing in India, I think,
Yeah.
in terms of manufacturing at least. But so are we going to be able to Are they going to be able to overcome the security aspects of the relationship to integrate better, or does that even matter at this point?
At one time, there was a compartmentalization between the border disputes, which were, coming out into skirmishes, etc., and
Mm-hmm.
became much bigger event more recently, and the economic and the trade issues. In many ways, it's because the rest of the world was not still thinking India is a good, attractive market
Mm-hmm.
because of its own bureaucracy, procedural problems, etc. And therefore, even though they had in 1991 major economic reforms of allowing more and more private sector, as opposed to government enterprises primarily dominating the economy, and India transformed brilliantly, liberalizing economic laws so that foreign companies can have 100%
Right.
equity, all that. In the meanwhile, Chinese relationship began to grow on the economic front, because China could buy a lot of industrial raw materials from India, including coal.
Yeah.
China could buy many minerals from India. And India could buy products that were not made in India, for example, from China, consumer electronics, especially smaller wattage power plants,
Mm.
energy plants. Chinese decided they can build very good, maybe no more than 55 megawatts or something like that, as opposed to 1,000. We all build very, very mega plants. So there's
Mm-hmm.
a market there for smaller plants that can survive in terms of local economy, etc. And they just dominated that business.
Mm.
As it went about Lenovo, for example, in PC business, very successfully competed because at one time both HP, surprisingly, and Dell thought that market is too, it's just not a pleasant to do business kind of a notion. So
Right.
in the meanwhile, Chinese knew how to do business there.
Hmm.
They came out with products with all price ranges, not only low quality, low price, because there is a price market out there, there's a demand out there, but Chinese began to also offer high quality, high price products.
Hmm.
And it happened in garment business, for example. It happened in consumer electronics business. It may happen in appliances with hire, for example, just went on. And automotive business for that matter. I mean, just goes on. So, I mean, given that, but today, for the first time, the Indian government has decided they will link the two things, the economic
Yeah.
aspect and the political, geopolitical aspects, security aspects primarily. And that's why, as you saw, Indian government decided they would not allow Chinese products to come in India. They would not allow Chinese software,
Yeah.
social media. They've banned so many in the process to say
Hmm.
we have an economic power to counterbalance your military power, essentially.
Right.
Typical thinking that's going on. The concept of China, India getting together was very real
Mm.
because it is a South to South cooperation. As advanced countries like G7 nations, while they expanded G20, many of the emerging economies felt they were marginalized.
Mm.
Brazil would be in that category, India would be in that category, South Africa was in that category. They're pretty significant economies, China. So they decided they can form their own group, which is called BRICS.
Hmm.
Not BRIC, but BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They created their own industrial bank. Like they thought that the World Bank and IMF are too biased against them, or they look upon these countries as like from a colonial
Right.
mindset,
Right.
and they decided they can start on their own.
Well, yeah, and
And
then there's the example of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that India is a part of, but the U.S. is not. I mean, it goes on and on. I guess my question is that is that current still flowing, right? Because it seems that the U.S. is particularly focused on, I don't want to say driving a wedge, but making India in particular choose in some
yeah,
way. Either you're a democracy that shares our values in the fight against, this global communism, right? And of course, it's not the same as it used to be with the Soviet Union, but that's tends to be more of the way the U.S. has coalesced around the thinking now.
yeah.
That you need to be on our side of the technological standards that are being developed, or you risk us not, helping fuel your economic rise.
I
And
think
China's doing the same thing, I think.
the US has realized now that India is a very strategic nation.
Hmm.
And partnering with India is in US interest. The Indian diaspora has done very well all over the world. For the numbers of Indian people settled abroad, you take the UK economy, cabinet ministers are of Indian origin, born, of course, in England. You take the Canadian economy, same thing.
Hmm.
They are very well integrated, contributing back to each society they have gone to. They have been always a net contributors. And in America, they have done exceptionally well
Hmm.
because we give them so many opportunities, not just as corporate CEOs of very large companies, which are quite a few Indian origin. There may be as many as 20 to 30 companies outside of the Silicon Valley, even, such as, for example, MasterCard, such as, for example, Domino Pizza. I think
Hmm.
about that one. For whatever reason, Indian managers have risen to the CEO and the chairman level, right?
Hmm.
So that talent has contributed enormously to the American economy and American psyche in many ways. It is now happening in the policy area, same thing. I mean, if you watch the COVID-19 newscast, any place,
Right.
any news broadcast, you always have some Indian expert on, immunology or
Hmm.
spreading of the disease.
Yeah.
Usually some sort of an Indian doctor out there who has been silently contributing, but now they are becoming more visible out there.
Hmm.
It's true in the stock market, in fact. Many of the great financial institutions have very strong research-based experts who are of Indian origin. I think that alignment is now therefore, so US thinks it's a very good partner to have. I don't think it'll be an ally in the sense of South
Yeah.
Korea or Japan. There'll be more partnership.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
that's a whole nother conversation we can get into on all the international affairs aspects of this. But I want to bring it back to the rule of three, and then I'm also going to open it up for questions for the audience. If y'all want to throw
Sure.
some questions in the chat, please do, and I'll read from there. Try to keep it short if possible. But given we haven't talked a lot about how the rule of three goes global and works in global markets. So if I am an exporter, for instance, or if I am a multinational in the U.S. that's thinking about my global strategy, how should the rule of three, particularly with the U.S., China, India in view, how should that affect how I'm thinking about the world and conquering the market or
There,
staying a niche player?
there are two comments. One is that you cannot be a truly global player unless you have a significant presence in all three markets, China, India, America, because they're the largest consumers of products and even industrial raw materials eventually, because consumer markets is the foundation of all the demand into industrial raw
Hmm.
materials market as we do value add. So it's very important to focus on consumer markets. These are the three largest consumer markets, especially more in future technologies like cell phones, smartphones, for example, tablets, and just goes on and on, right? Digital
Hmm.
technology. You have to be at least 2 in 3 to survive properly as a global player. And which is the again debate, therefore, if China market is not going to be as accessible because of the geopolitics, then it is in the interest of the American corporations to focus even more on India market, because just alone, American market alone is not going to be sufficient.
Hmm.
You will remain a niche player. I'll give you a concrete example. This is the worry we all have about American automobile makers. If you look at General Motors, Ford, Chrysler is already gone, it's owned by Fiat anyhow, but GM, GM has a very strong presence in China. If that presence gets somehow impacted negatively, it has no choice but to invest heavily in India.
Mm.
India is growing as a very, in fact, in small car market, India is the largest component maker in the world, more than Chinese.
Hmm.
Chinese began with bigger cars for whatever reason. Unlike Europeans or Italians with Fiat, which is a very small car, and counterparts into France and into England and other places by and large.
Hmm.
So it's very interesting because the population density, the roads being built, in a certain way. China has all the new infrastructure for roads, highways, where you can afford to have, like what we did 100 years ago, bigger cars. So that's very key. So GM's future lies with India, whether they like it or not.
Well, since you brought up the auto sector, where are we in the evolution of the automotive market globally? Because it doesn't seem to me that there is a big three yet. And
No,
now with the new focus on electrification, it seems like that, there might. So should we be thinking of it as segmented markets or categories among the broader automotive umbrella? Because otherwise that might be a challenge to your theory.
isn't that no, it's coming along very well. It's absolutely ironic that none of the American car makers have become truly global car dominant players. The largest now is Volkswagen Group, number one in the world.
Hmm.
Second largest is Toyota, which became number one, but it has just suddenly, they're neck and neck running. And now the question is, who will be number three?
Mm.
Will GM be the number three? Ford will be number three? Or would it be BMW number three or Honda number three? Nissan basically is gone essentially because it's a part of the more Renault Nissan group essentially. So
Yeah.
that's what we are speculating right now, analyzing to say who will be number three and why and how.
Mm.
If it is a European car maker, or it could be actually a Chinese car maker, which owns Volvo from Sweden, for example,
Right.
and they're making Volvo all electric. So
Hmm.
the notion of electric cars is no longer in the hands of the American car makers. That's
Mm.
lost battle. Because the largest car market is China today. They
Right.
will dictate what type of hot technology will come in. And today's cars is all software and chips. In
Right.
fact, I've always mentioned that Tesla to me reminds me of a very large mobile iPhone.
Yes.
Just like
Yes.
my iPhone, wherever I am, I can track it. It is driven by software with a very good hardware. And that's really what Tesla is all about.
Yeah, definitely.
Fewer
Uh,
components to make, easy to assemble. You don't have thousands of suppliers as it is in the traditional
mhm.
electromechanical age, for example. Largest cost anyhow in making automobile today is not steel as it used to be when I did a lot of consulting in the 70s and the 80s, but it is the chips. The
Right.
disk chips, the control chips, for example, the processing, memory, everything pretty much.
Hmm.
Automobile is the only place where I can integrate voice and data, telephone wise.
Interesting.
As nobody is able to integrate voice and data in an office space or at home. In fact, I did
Interesting.
a massive research in this area that I can have a server and a switch put together in the back in the trunk of the car, like VCR used to be at one time, remember, which is now embedded into a so CD kind of a stuff, which is
Yep.
now even more. I mean, I don't need anything to the satellite radio and everything. I can get it. But it's interesting. In the car, I could come out with a volume. 5 automobile guys can set the standard for the next generation of a switch for the telephone guys and server for the digital guys. Okay, it's interesting.
Hmm.
That much power they have. They will transform the whole Silicon Valley. It's called telematics. I worked at General Motors Research Lab many years ago. This is called the autonomous cars now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and we're seeing all this shakeout now with the chip shortage after COVID because a lot of the car makers did not order enough, and now we're worried about too much chip production being concentrated in the hands of the Taiwanese company TSMC,
Yes.
and so all of this is definitely relevant for today. We've got a few questions that came in through the chat. One is from Mubarak Ali. He says, do you see relationship marketing undergoing a sea change, and who are the people who have inspired you?
Yeah. Marketing is definitely going through sea change for at least 3 reasons. The biggest change agent for marketing as a practice and a discipline is technology. Marketing got organized around physical first. You go to a shopping center, you go to a grocery store, you buy your things, the consumer markets primarily. Today, people are thinking digital first, physical second. So what was complementary is becoming core, very similar to cell phone used to be complementary only in emergency,
Mm-hmm.
landline dominated. But today everybody starts with a cell phone first, and as a backup they have the landline phone, okay?
Right.
Same thing is happening now very clearly in marketing that people first go to the website to do everything.
Mm.
Search for information, address, etc., rather than go to the store and see if the merchandise is there or not, or go to the bank physically to deposit money. People
Right.
think it's digital. And the latest one I've seen from physical first to digital first is in televisit during COVID-19 lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
People had to use now Zoom technology to talk to their doctors, primary care specialists.
Mm.
But today, people would rather do televisit than go physically because it's a hassle.
Yeah.
Put clothes on, how to get in the car, drive in traffic, park it, pay for the parking, and then you have all these patients waiting who I don't know what diseases they have. The people are having all kinds of things. So today, in fact, it is estimated, I was shocked with the numbers, that in 2020, we might have crossed 1 billion, B as in boy, televisits in America.
Mm. Well, and yeah, I mean, you mentioned it too in the book. You talk about retailers in particular have to be omni-channel, right? They have to be
Absolutely.
everywhere because those who have survived, like Best Buy, kind of use their store as a showroom, right?
So that's,
And so people do the research, then they come in to test the products
yeah,
for sure.
absolutely.
Yeah, and I want to get to two more quick questions so we don't dwell on this too long. So we've got Abraham Ninan who says, how imperative is it for India to align strategically with the US in both the geopolitical and economic spheres?
It's a very difficult question from India's viewpoint because it has borders with a major power, which is China. And how do you protect security-wise your borders when it is surrounded by significant number of hostile countries in some fashion. China's expansion of Belt and Road Initiative, as it is called, which are the physical infrastructure, while it was designed for commerce and economics, it can be used for military purposes. Always has been done. We built whole West Coast for us, across the mountains for US Postal, but it is a military route at the same time for us to go, as we have done with airports and all this stuff. So given that situation, there's a strong worry about how do you defend yourself in case there is some hostile activity. And so in that case, you need some allies. And it seems like India is leaning toward US as a major ally, along with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Russia is an old friend, surprisingly. So now here, two people who don't get along, but both want to help you. So how do you manage that whole security side? On the other, from a market viewpoint, there is no question that India would rather do business with the US because US is a huge market, and India's real talent is the manpower, not the agricultural resource, which is very good. It was a land of honey and milk kind of a notion, largest milk producer in the world. It's not even industrial raw material, but the human talent is so large. So for example, we are now expecting that many of the Silicon Valley companies will establish their own employment base in India, very large scale, and they will be some of the largest employers in India. For IBM, India was number 3 after America and Japan. I think Japanese will be now number 3. India will become number 2 for IBM, but it'll be much bigger for Microsoft, much bigger for Google. And this is not outsourcing to Indian IT companies, but creating their own employee base, which is very good in many ways because they can offer technology, they can offer value-add things to the human beings to do bigger and better jobs than what we are able to do. So to me, they will be looking for India. I always say that if you're looking for gold, where do you go? You go to the gold mine. India is a gold mine.
Well, and you mentioned Russia. I think that's fascinating.
By the way, Trevor, this is not limited not limited to IT, please. True for professional services like legal, accounting, but also hospitality. India has a very talented people in hospitality, hotel, motel business. And they're all great managers for worldwide activities. So a chain like Sheraton or a Marriott nowadays will take people who are groomed there as packaged goods industries did, like Unilever at one time, or as, for example, technology companies have done, take these talent people, groom them to become global leaders of their organizations.
Yeah, and also you mentioned hospitality. You've got companies like Oyo, that are the Indian company that's kind of transforming, like consolidating a lot of the hotel market. So, I have one more question from Tanvi Chauhan. She says, you mentioned that the rule of three dwells on a naturally competitive market without excessive regulation. How does this play into something so decentralized as a crypto-based market? So what are your thoughts on cryptocurrency and technology? Go ahead, and if we have time, I'll ask an augmented question.
Tanvi, great question. Cryptocurrency is again one of those ideal products. Like the automobile industry 100 years ago, there are 4,000 cryptocurrency players right now, by the way. I was astounded with the numbers. Cryptocurrencies are now highly localized at the same time, not just the Bitcoin, which is more like a global architecture. There'll be huge shakeout mergers. It will happen not just by market process, but by regulation. It has become a real alternative to every country's currency. And the less strong the currency or weaker the currency, greater the presence of cryptocurrency. Unfortunately. Which is I can, unlike the old days where something like a George Soros can do the speculation and collapse your country, I can collapse the country's currency through cryptocurrency. It is that vulnerable. So regulation has to come in. People have never understood or analyzed how vulnerable many currencies of the world are, not US dollar or euro, for example, maybe Japanese yen or Chinese yuan, which is not even traded properly. But many currencies are under a lot of threat, which is the first major reason why regulation has to come out and make it legitimate in some fashion.
Yeah.
And mean the consolidation. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. My last thing, and then we'll turn it off because I know everybody's got to go. Similar question to Tanvi, except on the sort of market side, right? Like, do you, in terms of like China, for instance, very
Yes.
regulated, very closed off. I mean, does the rule of three change, or the strategy around it change based on higher barriers to entry and regulations in various markets?
Definitely, rule of three does not come in several situations. One is that when the industry is owned by partnerships, not by stock market.
Mm.
Consulting companies is in that category, accounting firms are in that category, where rule of three does not prevail.
Yeah.
Rule of three does not happen when there's a patent protection where you get a monopoly by government, giving
Mm-hmm.
you the right, whether it's any one of the vaccines, for example, now, or previous diseases, where patent gives them. So government doesn't allow actually competition by
Mm-hmm.
giving you the intellectual property right,
Right.
for cover your R&D, which is very anomaly, strange kind of a concept, So
Yeah.
that's a second. The third reason is regulated markets, not countries, but certain markets are always more regulated than others. Generally, money markets are much more regulated. Money is such an important commodity that it cannot be allowed to have a free market process. Otherwise, people can speculate to a level where you can destroy the whole nation. So money is always regulated every country-wise, pretty much, whatever.
Yeah.
So that's the third area. And the fourth one, of course, is countries which are regulated. So as the countries begin less regulated, like India is opening up to allow you 100% ownership, for example. So you now say, I can manufacture as well as import or export, right, etc. I can bring my suppliers in automobile industry. If you are the assembler like a General Motors, you bring in hundreds of suppliers.
Right.
Or aerospace industry the same way, appliance industry, all have large supply chain players, and they're all partners. And supplier buyer relationship is pretty strong generally. So given that, I think that's another area that's very interesting to watch. So what the point I'm making is that as the market gets deregulated and level playing field is allowed, or you have national heroes that you want to promote, like in China,
Right.
or India at one time. We had the same thing at one time.
Mm-hmm.
We had more restrictions on this in this country. We used against Europeans product safety laws, so they cannot export their product over here, by the way. We used
Well,
all kinds of USDA regulations for agricultural products,
oh
so
yeah.
so Scandinavians cannot sell their processed foods products, branded consumer products over here because they were not certified by our USDA. I mean, we have regulatory bodies that have done a fantastic
Yeah.
job of controlling the market. We sort of talk about free markets,
Oh
but
yes. I've never seen anyone so impassioned as when I was at in Brussels meeting with the phytosanitary trade people from the EU who were talking about chicken and chlorine and everything. So yeah, that's a whole other discussion, but shows that we need to really understand the markets we're getting into, and hope that people will buy the book. We're going to send everyone the link to where they can purchase it in the follow-up email, and we'll also be doing a summary. Dr. Sheth, I want to thank you so much for participating with us and sharing your generous insights. And hopefully everyone enjoyed it and will join us for next month's event, which will be focused on a Georgia Tech professor named Kirk Bowman, who has written a book called Rethinking Global Philanthropy. He's going to talk a lot about case studies he's seen in Brazil, where they use direct funding models with local nonprofits versus international, massive international nonprofit conglomerates, if you will. But that should be fascinating. That one will be in person at our office. We'll have 20 slots available for that, but then we'll also broadcast it as well to those who can't make it. Dr. Sheth, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting.
All right. Talk to you all soon. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.